recording this webinar. This is Beautifying Communities Through Conservation and Land Trusts. And before we get started with the content, I'm going to talk a little bit about EPIP. Some of you already know who we are. EPIP is a national network of foundation professionals, social entrepreneurs, and other change makers who strive for excellence in the practice of philanthropy. We provide a platform for our community to connect with others, learn and practice skills, leadership skills, and inspire emerging ideas in the social sector. We also wanted to mention that we have our next webinar coming up in 2 weeks, how funders can effectively support volunteer-led movements. And I'm happy to say that today's webinar is the launch of our fall webinar calendar. So we're really excited to get started with some great webinars for the next couple of months. And we have some terrific local chapter events happening at our local chapters across the country. So I urge you to check out the calendar at epip.org/events. So a little bit of housekeeping rules. Please use the question box for technical difficulties and any questions you might have for our speaker, John Rohe, who will be answering questions for you later on today. And if you are live tweeting, please use the hashtag EPIPwebinar to join the conversation through Twitter. As I mentioned, this webinar is going to be recorded, or is being recorded now, and hopefully it will be posted on our site by the end of the week. And also, please complete the post-webinar survey. And so I'd like to introduce our speaker today, John Rohe, who is the Vice President of Philanthropy at the Colcom Foundation. And I'm going to switch it over to you, John. So
thank you, Emily.
1 second while I switch this over to you.
Thank you very much, Emily.
Thank you, John.
All right, I assume we're ready to go. Well, thank you all for joining us today as we launch into this new season and talk about land trusts, conservation in the communities. So first, let's do a little outline as to what we're going to do today. Why are there land trusts? And then some specifics, some mechanics. What do they do and how can they help you? How might this be relevant to you? So, why are there land trusts? In answering that question, we might ponder, why would someone even begin a land trust? And the answer to that question might very well be parallel to the reason that you're here today. What's your story? What's your narrative? It would be nice if we could all be in the same room and see each other and get a sense for that. Unfortunately, we don't have that through a webinar, but the question of why you're here is relevant to why a land trust might be formed. Maybe you're here because you remember a walk in the woods with a grandparent, or maybe you're involved in caring for youth. Possibly you're involved in the educational system. You might have an involvement with elder care. Maybe it's a care for the community. Somehow, everyone here has self-selected themselves because of some love of the land, your surroundings, your communities. You've recognized some deficiency, and maybe in this world we're swept away by technology and wondering if we're leaving something behind. There's a loss. It's not easy to describe, but yet it's palpable, it's tangible. How many problems might be solved if we had places that were worthy of our affection, places that were worth caring about, places that can be preserved through conservation? Would we be better parents, better teachers, students? Would we care more for our families? Or would it suffice to just say that we'd have greater pride in our communities where we know it's home? There are fewer parks around now. They're no longer being created by our tax dollars. They're not to be found in subdivisions. This once beautiful civic amenity in our cities is now being neglected. Maybe we understand the importance of having this place that we can call home. So is it a concern to some of us that maybe the natural experience for the child is something that this child would feel from the back seat of a car, much like a drive-by movie? could a greater affinity for the land, a restoration of these bonds to the land, maybe diminish the bullying in schools? Would it help the sense of empathy? Would it prepare students for STEM jobs? Would it foster their imagination, cultivate curiosity, promote flexible thinking, strategic solutions? Could they imagine the unimagined? There's a certain irony that the connectedness that we have with all of this technology might, in fact, induce a detachment. So, here's just a humble confession from me, and that is that I'm just a dad. I'm a grandfather, a grandparent, and that's what draws me here. And that's as good a qualification, perhaps, as any of us can bring to this. So we have an opportunity to pass on our love of the land. We have an opportunity to tell our stories, and hopefully our generation will be judged responsibly by the future. So while we're at it, maybe we can save another endangered species, and that would be the child with a nature deficit. That child is in our midst today. So we're soon going to get to this section of the program here where we'll talk about land trusts. What do they do? How do they operate? So the answer to the question of why would a land trust be formed? Why would someone go out of their way to create a land trust? Again, that's the same answer as you might have given for the reason for sitting here. And again, thank you. Thank you very much for taking the time for this. Okay, so what does a land trust do? What is it? Well, the land trust will preserve land. And by the way, we'll talk very shortly about what you can do right within your community if you're in a city. But first, let's go outside of the city. Let's see what it does on the periphery of town. All right, so there's nature preserves. These nature preserves represent lands that have been donated to a conservancy. Conservancy is just another 501c3 tax-exempt entity, much like any of the nonprofits that you see around town. But they'll hold title to real estate. So here's a nature preserve that someone donated to the land trust. This someone made a decision to not exploit the property for its economic potential. They didn't sell it to Walmart. They didn't sell it for a parking lot. Instead, their affinity for the land enabled them to donate it to the Conservancy, where they would derive the maximum confidence that this land and its biodiverse heritage would be perpetuated and carried like a crucible into the future. Now, these nature preserves, by the way, are commonly available to the public. Sometimes they're not. Maybe they'll have an endangered species on them, and the whole reason for the nature preserve is to protect that endangered species. And in those cases, well, the public probably isn't invited. But by and large, you'll find manicured trails. You'll find a sign that announces where the property is situated. And if you call the Conservancy, they'd be delighted to have you go out there. And no matter who you're working with, is it the elderly? Is it a child? Is it a child in need? Is it a family? Is it a school? Whatever it is, these nature preserves are available to you. The Conservancy can also hold a linear preserve. Here's a bike path. They can hold that. It might be along a waterfront. It might be an old abandoned rail corridor. These amenities for the communities are held often by the Conservancy, again, in perpetuity, in public trust. There's also a viewshed. Sometimes a Conservancy would hold an easement, for example. Well, it's an interest in land that's short of ownership, but it assures that nothing would be built on the intervening property. So maybe if this was a viewshed, the Conservancy could assure that there would be, along the roadside here, no buildings constructed, no billboards, no obstructions on this roadside to, in perpetuity, perpetuate this viewshed, wherever it might be. So property interests held by the Conservancy can be one of two ways. Outright ownership, where they take title to the land. As a retired lawyer, that has certain meaning, but it means that they own it outright. Now, they can also have a so-called conservation easement. that's a big word for a concept that enables the Conservancy to assure that this land will be kept in a certain state, principally its natural state, in perpetuity, but the Conservancy doesn't own title to the real estate. It doesn't own the land. The farmer might still own the land. The Conservancy is something like a police department that assures that whatever the interest of that, say, farmer was at the time the conservation easement was given, whatever that interest is, keep it as a farm. No Walmarts, no parking lots, just a house, a barn, and everything else remains natural for the cattle that might be roaming this land. Under a conservation easement, the Conservancy becomes that, say, police department that every year will go out and monitor the property and assure that there have been no modifications that would violate the terms of the conservation easement, the protective agreement. And if there was, then they would, of course, start a lawsuit or take whatever remedial action they would have to take. So here, for example, might be a conserved farm. You get an idea of what this might look like. Here's perhaps property that would still be owned by the farmer, and the Conservancy goes out on a conservation easement, assuming the Conservancy had a conservation easement. They would go out at least annually, monitor the land, see that Walmart hasn't, I'm sorry to pick on Walmart, it could be anybody, but see that the property has not been substantively modified and that the habitat remains intact. So that could be a conserved farm that is protected with a conservation easement. So here's other services that could be provided by a land trust. They provide educational programming. They have specialized expertise. They have people who often understand the natural characteristics of the land, and they're delighted to put on programs for this. I'm probably preaching to the choir here. Many of the people here might be familiar with conservancies in your area, but there will be educational programming, and it's made available to the public. And if you have a particular special need, maybe you have a class, maybe you have elderly or whoever, they will adapt their programming for you. They're typically delighted to do that, and often it helps them with their fundraising as well. So you should feel good about contacting them. They're also often involved in community beautification. We're going to talk more about that momentarily. And also in monitoring. Now the monitoring, again, that comes in through both the conservation easement and in the nature preserves. Remember, a nature preserve is property that the Conservancy would own outright. Conservation easement, they just have the right to patrol it. But they monitor that land and assure that it remains in its natural state. So that brings us to another part of the program here. What can a land trust do for you today, right now? And one way of thinking of this is how many problems might be solved if everyone had a place worth caring about. If we have a place that brings out the best in people, what does that do for a community? What does that do for us? Are we more likely, for example, to pick up a piece of litter in a community that respects us as people than if we live in the presence of, say, billboards and sprawl and unnatural situations? How would that change us? How would that affect philanthropy? How would that affect the need for philanthropy? What does that do for us? So here's, for example, just a specimen photograph of a community beautification project. This is by the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy. I'm in Pittsburgh. That's where my office is. You look at the bottom of your screen, you'll notice it's 81 degrees in Pittsburgh. Not bad today. And so here's a project by the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy. It's a community beautification project. They get the community involved, and there's funding, of course, provided by this. They'll often get schools involved. There will be beautification clubs. There'll be a number of people that around the community that get involved and volunteer their time on these things, and it's just helpful to a community. It might be one of those nuances that defies description. It's not like anybody comes into town and is blown away by this little flower, but yet it's a nuance that you know it when you see it. Here's another one that is a local situation. It's a welcoming green space in a community. Before this, who knows what it might have been? It might have been gravel. So the Conservancy comes in and knows the indigenous species in this area, knows what will work, offers its expertise, probably gets the volunteers together from the community, and we have a nice little welcoming space for the community. Is that going to change everything in town? No. But is it worth doing? Absolutely. It brings people together. It's a source of pride. And it's a great way to make the community a more special place. So again, these are indescribable aspects of a community. It's not like we can put our finger on anything in particular, but we know it just because it's there. It's palpable. Schools can also be benefited by this. Here's a school beautification project administered by a conservancy. They bring the expertise that possibly might not be present in the school to know exactly what type of species would go in there, how should they be maintained, what should the watering schedule be, what type of soil is best suited for this or the other. And you got the kids involved. It's who loses on something like this? It's just brings people together. And if you're in towns in the Rust Belt, Pittsburgh, for example, is a wonderful example of this. Wonderful. It's an example of a Rust Belt town that actually is making its way back, often the most livable city in the United States and in the world. And it's a Rust Belt community. And how does that happen? How did that take place? Well, sometimes it's just that vacant lot that gets transformed, that brings people together, that solves an issue relating to the food desert. These people are learning something about planting crops on an otherwise vacant property. They share this land. They have seed exchanges, seed swaps with other community garden people in town, and it takes a source of deterioration in a community and transforms it into something beautiful, something useful, something healthy, something that builds a trade, that builds understanding of how the world operates. And for these kids, you might look at a child here and say, how many senses of that child are activated when they're looking at an iPad versus the number of senses that are illuminated by something like this, where they're thinking about how they're part of a system and how to grow things and where the food came from rather than just the freezer case in the grocery store. There's a lot going on here, and again, it's the nuance, it's the subtlety, it's the things that might not even be openly discussed, but they're happening right here, where neighbors who otherwise would be alienated from each other, don't even know each other, now have a reason to get together, and they're transforming a source of blight into something that builds a community. Top that. So, if we're taking this really seriously, here's something in the outskirts of town where we can look at preserving, again, a natural habitat. You see the deer in the background there. And this might be a conservation easement. It might be a nature preserve held by the community. But let's take that child away from the city and move him out there. Let's take him out there. Let's go for that walk in the woods. And again, these properties are open. They're available to you. Obviously, the Conservancy would expect that they be dignified, respectfully, and that there would be no destructive activity, of course. But these are available, and let's take that kid out there. Let's take the elderly person out. Let's take them to these properties, these wild places. Let's walk on the wild side. So here's maybe some other ideas worth talking about. We see our surroundings transformed from one day to the next. The changes that take place are often imperceptible just because our bodies don't resonate, our minds don't resonate at that level. And yet, if we find someone who, say, comes back to town after 30 years, or if you go back to the place that you grew up after leaving and serving in the military, or going to school, or starting a life somewhere else, and go back, and you see the transformation that has taken place. You see how there might have been a great deal more sprawl out there, how the relationships on the land have changed dramatically. There have been subdivisions that crop up that are all auto-dependent. There's no sidewalk. There's no way to get around. That putting a kid on a bicycle, even on the roadway or in the parking lot, is a form of child abuse. It's all changed, and yet from one day to the next, these changes are imperceptible, that we don't even see them. But we know that something very important has taken place when we come back after 20 years, 30 years. How did that just happen? Obviously, it didn't just happen. It happened from one little change to the next, and everybody was negotiating in good faith. And, oh, yeah, it'll just be one more. Okay, just one more. And the cumulative effect of all of this then catches up. And eventually we see that that everything has changed. The relationships have changed. The source of pride in the community has changed. And we've maybe even become a transient people, that it doesn't matter where you are. Every place looks the same. And if you don't know where you are, you really don't know where you are. It's all the same. It's every town has become any town USA. So how do we maybe begin to reestablish a source of pride, reestablish a place worth caring about, especially in philanthropy, where we're liberated to think about things, to think about the long term, the big picture, the opportunities that might lie out there? How do we do that? Well, a number of examples have just been given to us. We can consult with the Conservancies. We can meet with the local land trusts. We can get to know them if you don't already, and they're just like us. They're motivated by the same reasons that you're here today. Nothing different. It's the same thing. They're sensing something. And no matter what that is, that same sentiment will be paralleled at the Conservancy. And they'll enjoy working with you. So again, don't be a stranger. Let them know that you're around, and don't feel guilty about calling them either, thinking that you're imposing on some charitable institution, taking their time. Maybe that's a deterrent. I'm not sure, but it shouldn't be, because that's what they do. And the more that they can do for you, the more they can go out in the street and beat the bushes and bring more money in for themselves. And before long, you might be helping them do that too. So, you know, on the topic of making places that bring out the best in other people, bring out the best in ourselves, enable a child to learn something more about empathy, to be maybe a little more thoughtful, to understand the bigger picture, the dynamic in a community. What other incremental changes do we do? Where might we dig in our heels? And by the way, these could be subjects that would come up in subsequent conferences, webinars that could be considered. Billboards is one of those nuances. If we love the land, the reason that if you love this place that you're in and you want to make it the best possible, think about a billboard for a minute. Think about what that does to a community. The billboard company basically acquires a sliver of land, maybe 5, 10, 15 feet in width, puts up a big sign, and unlike any other form of advertising, they have a captive audience on streets that we have paid for as taxpayers, in a car that we pay the gas, and they've essentially conscripted our freedom of thought in a way. Maybe I've got, hopefully there aren't billboard people on the line here. If people start dropping out, we'll know why. But they just detract from a community, and they obscure the scenic aesthetics of a community. Just ask yourself this question: where would a person be more likely to pick up a piece of litter? Beneath a billboard, or maybe in the presence of some historic architecture? The natural aesthetics in a community. Why we would turn that over to someone that just treats us as a good consumer is a question that's being asked across the country. And so, one thought is, another step is to look at these billboards. Think of what a historic building in your alma mater, your high school or college might look like if there was a billboard that obscured that historic structure. There, the change would be palpable. It would be visible, and yet when it crops up in our town, sometimes we're anesthetized to it. We don't even realize it. But it's one of the same things. It's just it's a first cousin to that natural landscape that we hope to restore, the natural experiences that we hope to restore for the child, for the elderly person, the person in need. How about the night sky? Here's another concept. Children in our cities will go through life never once experiencing the awesome display that's overhead. And why is that? Well, when we fly over our cities, we can see why. Because there's a huge carbon footprint being expressed on the night sky. And it's visible when we're up in the... There's no reason to illuminate the heavens, by the way, the sky. As we're flying over, that's a total loss. That carbon footprint, the energy that is going into illuminating that, is a total loss. It doesn't illuminate the street. It doesn't make us any safer. All it does is draw the shade on the night sky, and the urban child will never experience that. They often will not have an opportunity to get out and beyond the city by often hundreds of miles before they can see the night sky. And so that's lost. And yet it doesn't take much to expose it. They can have lighting structures that have caps on the top that don't have that stray lighting that just shoots up into the sky. There's no reason that we can't have, maybe even require, capping on all of our lighting, and shine the light down where it helps us, not up in the sky where it takes it away from the child. No one could possibly be opposed to these things. It's really just like the Conservancy. No one, there really isn't any opposition to any of this. These are all 100% positives. And yet it's sometimes very difficult to move these dials. I don't know why, but in our hearts, we know that no one in their right mind would possibly say, a kid living in a city has no right to see the night sky. That will never get anyone elected. And yet, that's what we're doing. With all of our activity, we go around and every new used car parking lot will have stray lighting that further obscures the night sky, and eventually it's eclipsed. And it's not like you can put your finger on any one particular light, just like you can't put your finger on any one park that is no longer being maintained, that therefore is the cause for a child perhaps losing a sense of place in their town. It's just like every snowflake in an avalanche pleads innocent. The fact is, every one of these light bulbs is responsible. Every one of these city parks that we neglect is responsible. Every lost opportunity for conservation is responsible. Every city lot that is just vacant and a source of blight that isn't a community garden is responsible. Every one of these things. And so understanding the cumulative effect of all this stuff is often pretty important in whether we're talking about land conservation, restoring a sense of place with fewer billboards, restoring the night sky. Again, nobody's opposed to this stuff. So Well, depending on how many questions we have, I could go on for a while, but I kind of welcome any questions that might be out there. Any thoughts?
So far, no questions yet, John, but I encourage everybody to not be shy and to type in a question in the question box.
Well, while we're waiting, let me review a couple points and see if I can provoke a few questions from people. In other words, who are you working with? You're here, someone is here for a reason. Who are you working with? Let's explore that. Who would that person be that's suffering from a nature deficit, as they call it? Is it a child who's missing out on one of life's basic fundamental rights that a person has to understand what a natural setting is like? Who is it that we hope to benefit by this? Who is it that's in our heart? Who is it that we're caring about?
So, John, I think your trick worked. We have a question here from Sam who wants to know how. I'm sorry, could you guys wait 1 second? Sorry about that. We're having a little technical difficulty on our end. So Sam's question is, how do I effectively work with a trust to secure land in our community? What issues do they face for sustainability and how are they funded?
Okay, so when you say a trust, Sam, I assume you're speaking of a land trust. And by the way, that term is synonymous with a conservancy. It's the same thing. Now trusts can be a lot of other legal relationships as well, but your use of the word trust here, I'll assume, is for a land trust, and if that's an erroneous assumption, please correct me.
He says yes, and Sam has one other point to add. He says their issue is with a large developer that is buying up blocks of property in their neighborhood.
Okay, so that would suggest it's a city neighborhood, and so this is an area that isn't presumably in a natural state right now. It's and maybe it's relevant to discuss historic conservation easements as well here, Sam. If when you say a neighborhood block, I'm thinking that this is in a city where there have been homes. Maybe some of those homes have deteriorated over a period of time, and or for whatever reason, the economic incentives right now are for tearing down something that's there and substituting or throwing up, pun intended, something that is architecturally less attractive and, as it often is these days, built for the life of the mortgage rather than for the ages. So if that's kind of what you're looking at, there can be historic conservation easements, and there will be institutions, nonprofits, just like land trusts, that have that protect history. Many communities have this. In Pittsburgh, we have it's the landmark, historic landmark nonprofit that will take a conservation easement on say the facade of a building, and thereby assure that no one has the right to destroy that historic facade, or maybe the historic banister inside, or whatever historic aesthetic component there might be on that building. That could be helpful here, because if you don't have some natural amenity on the land, if in other words, if it's a city block without much natural amenity, and unless it's a big piece of land, the Conservancy, a land trust, might not be interested in that. And the reason is they can't allocate their resources to monitoring that and maintaining it, because it's just a small piece of property, and they have to be prudent and judgmental in how they allocate their resources. Sam, I hope that's helpful. There's probably more to that question that's eluding this answer here, and that's only because I don't have the specifics. I'm making some assumptions, and I hope they're accurate.
Thanks for your question, Sam. And Sam says, thank you. Back to you, John. John, while we're waiting for some other questions to trickle in, I was wondering if you might have maybe a brief story to tell us of a successful conservation effort that you've been involved with in the past.
Yeah, I'd love to. Actually, there have been many in my 30 years of law practice. Before I came to the foundation 10 years ago, I used to form land trusts and counsel them and do their documents. And there are any number of gratifying experiences. What we normally find is that you might wonder, how does this come about? Well, mom and dad, walk into my law office, and they have a piece of property that they inherited from their family, and they remember their grandfather taking them out for a walk in the woods, or the old fishing hole where they went fishing, and they love this land. They also want to care for their family. They know that someday they're going to pass on, and they want to leave an estate for their kids and whatever, but they also have this affinity for the land, so there's a little conflict there, right? You could sell the land and convert it into some money and pass it off to your kids. On the other hand, they see how everything has been transformed around them, and how these natural amenities have been eclipsed. And so, again, for the same reason that, Sam, you're sitting out there in this webinar, and the other people that are here, for this very same motivation, they come in and they say, I want to save this. I'd like to do that. And how can I do that? So then we facilitate a relationship with the Conservancy. And by the way, there are favorable tax incentives that go with this. Nothing that would rival the total value, the money that they could get by selling the land, but still, there are favorable tax incentives that go with this. Enough said on that. We don't have to get into the specifics, but there's a little motivation there. And often the government continues to increase those incentives to make it more and more justifiable financially to make a donation of a land or of a conservation easement. So then we facilitate this relationship with the land trust, and the people realize that this is the best way that we have as a society to secure this property over the long term in perpetuity. Giving it to the government, for example, for a park, well, the government isn't maintaining the land very much these days. So giving it to a private entity, a nonprofit, where they are committed, everyone is screened on the board of directors, they have one function in life, and that is to perpetuate the natural habitat of these lands. So that's probably as good as it gets for anybody. And by the way, if they were giving a conservation easement, they would, in other words, where they're hiring the Conservancy to serve as the police department to assure that a parking lot will not be put in there, those donations of a conservation easement will often be accompanied by a substantial grant to the Conservancy as well. It could be $25,000, $30,000 or more dollars. That money is put into a war chest by the Conservancy to assure that it will have the means in perpetuity to enforce the terms of the conservation easement, to pay their staff to go out and monitor the property at least annually. Sometimes they'll fly over it if it's a big enough piece of property, and then to take the enforcement action against the the subsequent landowner when they try to violate the terms of the conservation easement. So, and to be more specific, well, I practice law in northern Michigan. The Little Traverse Conservancy, for example, has protected over 40,000 acres, as I recall, and over 100 miles of shoreline, a lot of waterfront property, Lake Michigan property, inland lakes, and that's just since 1972. So every one of these has a story, and the stories are absolutely magnificent. The motivational criteria that drives people to surrender the financial value of that property and turn it over for future generations, the motivational criteria, there's a story to be told. Every one of these stories is magnificent. And again, they often relate back to some childhood experience, something with a grandparent, something where these people see that there's a loss, and they want to do everything they can to perpetuate that. And you're doing them a favor. You are honoring them when through whoever you're affiliated with, you bring people out to appreciate those natural amenities. And maybe if while you're at it, look into that story. Look into what was that motivational criteria. Why did Mr. Smith and Mrs. Smith donate? Why did they do something that crazy? Why did they turn their back on the financial rewards on this piece of property and turn it over to the land trust? Why would they do that? It's a wonderful story, and it's
John?
a story that needs to be told. Yep.
So we actually have a couple more questions that have come in.
Great.
I'm going to read one from Libby, who says, I've heard from conservation organizations in my area that there's a struggle to engage diverse community members. Do you know of examples of land trusts that have been able to engage community members in order to reflect the community where they are located?
Yes. And on a personal level, I haven't actually experienced a difference based on race. My friends of across the community, I have friends that respect conservation, that enjoy the land, and it may be that I will tell you that in my professional career, I'm not involved in the schools, and that's just my law career and philanthropy haven't taken me there. But it is conceivable to me that inner city children would be particularly suffering from a nature deficit, and to the extent that that's the case, that defines the charge. That defines the responsibility that we all have to bring them out there. And it's just a matter of getting them there. There are buses, there's opportunity, there's a class that engage their senses, expand it. If that's the case, again, I'm sorry I can't speak to what's happening to the inner city schools because I don't get there myself. That's not where I am. But if I was, I can assure you that that's what I'd be doing.
John, we have.
And I encourage you to do the same.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that question, Libby. And we have another question from Naima, who introduced herself. She says she's from Orange, New Jersey, and there are a number of vacant lots in her neighborhood, with many slated for redevelopment for affordable housing. One caveat, the city is only 1 point square something. I don't know what that is, Naima. Any ideas of how to get the conversation going around nature and open space given the city's constraint and budgetary issues?
Well, it often is not a city issue. This is private. The things that I'm talking about here are private relationships with private entities, not governmental entities. So, Naima, the first place you would perhaps go is to your local conservancy, or there might be other nonprofits involved in converting local lots that are otherwise blighted into community gardens. So you at least cultivate an interest in doing something with that property other than allowing it to go toward whatever that next thing is that sounds like it isn't as nice as having it in some natural state. So talk to the conservancy, your local conservancy. If they don't engage in that type of thing, community gardens, they would probably be in a position to refer you to someone else in the community. And if they're not, well, this is a role for philanthropy. Maybe we need to start some. Maybe we need to kick this in gear. Maybe we need to find that person who has the motivation to do this, who can arrange the seed swaps, who can educate people on how to do local farming, who can make a little investment in some tools that can be shared by people working with a community garden, and kick it into gear. I hope that helps, Naomi. You were looking at governmental sources, and I'm now answering with a private source. Hope that helps.
Thank you, John. So here at EPIP, we talk a lot about diversity and inclusion, and we and that conversation really extends to how to engage people from all sectors, from all corners of life. So going back to Libby's question earlier about diverse community members, what are some tactics that you've used in the past or that you know of that have worked to engage a diversity of board members or staff members or donors to come along and be engaged in what you're doing?
All right. Well, there's the paths that have been crossed in the past, and where we have a track record, are in your town, in your area. There is some gateway. There is some piece of property that people see when they're coming into town. And right now, it might be vacant. Right now, there might be gravel on it. Right now, it might take a great deal of imagination to understand what that could be. But if you talk to people at the Conservancy, at your local land trust, they might very well, they'll have the expertise to know what could fit there, what could grow in that situation. Maybe it's shaded and obscured, so there'll be certain species that would work better than others. And they would know what type of remediation would need to be conducted on that piece of property in order to make it habitable for whatever you hope to grow there. And that way you get people involved. And the Conservancy has an incentive in doing this too, because they'll be associated with this, and that will embed them deeper in the community. So they'll be appreciative of these efforts in most cases. And so, that's a way to just get people involved. And once they're involved, once they're engaged, they're aware of the Conservancy, maybe they'll spend the nominal amount to be a member, and maybe they'll understand a little more as to where these nature preserves are around town. And on weekends, it wouldn't be surprising to find them making their way around to these nature preserves. So, your question kind of is, where does it start? It's not where does it end, where does it start? And a good way to start is something in town.
Thanks, John, and thanks everybody for your questions. So, by the way, one of our chapter leaders, Bridget, on the West Coast, has some resources that she's happy to share with everybody about engaging diverse populations. So thank you, Bridget, and we'll try to send that out to everybody after the webinar. So we have a couple minutes for some final questions, and otherwise, John, I think if nothing else trickles through, we can start wrapping it up.
Well, happy to wait for another question. I know sometimes it takes a while for people to formulate their question, and so